Good day. The mystery visit of William Burns, CIA director, to Moscow on 2nd and 3rd November becomes ever stranger. We've had information from the Russians, a brief readout in which the Russians said that in his discussions with the powerful head of Russia's National Security Council, Nikolai Patrushev, Burns and Patrushev spoke about US-Russia relations. The strangest and most bizarre readout I've ever seen provided by a government following a meeting with a top official of another country. Then we had a US report in CNN, which I discussed in my previous program, which said that the reason Burns visited Moscow was to discuss and talk about the situation in Ukraine, where the United States is becoming increasingly concerned that a war is pending. And then we had confirmation from the Russians that over the course of the visit, Burns didn't just speak to Patrushev, the secretary, as I said, of Russia's Security Council. He also spoke to Sergei Naryshkin, who is the head of the SVR, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, the organization that is the closest counterpart within the Russian intelligence community to the CIA. Now we've had more information, this time also from the Russians. It turns out that at some point, Burns picked up the telephone and spoke with none other than Vladimir Putin himself. Now, it's not clear whether he did that whilst he was physically present in Russia, or whether he did that prior to his trip to Russia or after his trip to Russia. The Russians are not providing any information about this whatsoever. In addition, there is no word so far of a readout about this trip, this conversation between Putin and Burns on the Russian Kremlin website. I've checked the Kremlin website this morning and there is no reference to such a telephone conversation there. Instead, we've had confirmation that this telephone conversation took place from Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov. And there is now a comment, a discussion of this call carried by the official Russian news agency, ETHEREUM. And I'm now going to read it out. Russian President Vladimir Putin has discussed with Director of the US Central Intelligence Agency, William Burns, Russian-US relations, the diplomatic crisis, regional conflict, and cybersecurity in a phone conversation, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov told journalists on Monday, 8th November 2021. Such a phone conversation did take place, he said in response to a corresponding question. Bilateral relations were discussed, the crisis situation in the diplomatic practice, and exchange of opinions on regional conflicts took place, the Kremlin official noted. He also confirmed that the sides discussed the issues of cybersecurity. On November 2nd, 3rd, Burns visited Moscow with a delegation of high-ranking US officials. On November 2nd, he had a meeting with Secretary of Russia's Security Council, Nikolai Patrushev, and Director of Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, Sergei Naryshkin. According to the SVR, Burns and Naryshkin discussed the fight against international terrorism and the interagency interaction. At the meeting with Patrushev, the relations of Moscow and Washington were discussed, according to the press service of the Russian Security Council. Now, that is extremely brief. That, in fact, tells us very little, but it does tell us something. First of all, we learn about the extraordinary fact that Burns spoke with but did not meet Putin. Now, I think we need to take a step back and just assess and understand what a remarkable thing that is. Generally, Vladimir Putin, when he speaks to officials of other countries, speaks to the equivalents in those countries of himself. Thus, if he speaks to the United States, if he has to have interaction with the leadership of the United States, he speaks to and accepts call from the president and not from any junior officials. He does the same when he interacts with the governments of, say, Britain or France or Germany. He speaks to the Prime Minister of Britain, the President of France, or the Chancellor of Germany. He would certainly not speak in any normal situation with the heads of the intelligence services of those countries. Normally, what would happen is that the person who would speak with the heads of the intelligence services of those countries would be the head of the intelligence service within Russia itself. In fact, people like Patrushev and Narishkin, who had those conversations with William Burns. It is not entirely unheard of for Putin to speak to top officials of other countries, but that would normally happen in the context of a meeting whilst those officials were present in Moscow. So, to give an example, Putin met during the early months of Donald Trump's administration with Tillerson, who was the then Secretary of State. Tillerson came to Moscow and Putin had a brief meeting with him. And Putin does from time to time have meetings with senior officials like that. If the US Secretary of State is in Moscow, then Putin will from time to time receive him. Not always, not invariably, but it does happen. For him to speak to an official over the telephone is unusual. For him to speak on the telephone with the director of the CIA is extraordinary. And for him to do that whilst that director of the CIA is in Moscow, which is what I suspect happened, well, that is absolutely astonishing. The assumption I must make is that Burns came to Moscow intending to meet with Putin, but that the Russians refused, insisted that he had to meet with his counterparts, namely Patrushev and Narishkin, as is consistent with diplomatic protocol. Burns was clearly unhappy with that, insisted on a meeting, and the Russians said, well, all right, since you want to have a discussion with Putin, then you can speak to him on the phone, but an actual physical meeting is out of the question. So that, I suspect, is what happened. That suggests a number of interesting facts. It shows how important in the perception of the United States government this trip by Burns to Moscow was. The fact that he clearly went there with the approval of the President of the United States himself. Well, as we've discussed in that previous program that I've just done, it seems that Burns might have been instructed by the President of the United States to go to Moscow, and it seems that Burns, whilst he was in Moscow, was trying to establish interactions with Putin himself, with the person at the very highest level of the Russian government, namely Putin, on the instructions of no less a person than the US President, than Joe Biden. And what makes that even more extraordinary is that, as I discussed in my previous program, discussing this visit, there's nothing to prevent Biden picking up the telephone and speaking to Putin directly. But that doesn't seem to be what he wants to do at the moment. Instead, he sends this emissary, Burns, to Moscow instead, and tries to get Burns to talk to Putin on his behalf whilst he is in Moscow, probably angling for an actual meeting, but when that isn't possible, arranging for a telephone conversation instead. Now, why did that happen? Well, I think we can reach some preliminary conclusions. The first comes back to the topics which I discussed in my two previous videos. Firstly, the foreign policy team of the President of the United States, his Secretary of State, his National Security Advisor, his Defense Secretary, his Vice President are clearly not up to the job. And it seems increasingly that the President himself is coming to that conclusion and is taking steps to conduct diplomacy in a semi-secret way via the director of the CIA, cutting out these important people, supposedly important people, the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, the Defense Secretary, I would add the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and of course the Vice President. So he's trying to cut them out. But he's also apparently unwilling to pick up the telephone to speak to the Russian President and to discuss matters with the Russian President directly. And why would that be so? Now, that does seem, on the face of it, extraordinary. Perhaps he's trying to convey to the Russians some sort of political point. He's trying to say to the Russians he himself is not prepared to talk to Putin. Maybe he's not up to talking to Putin. We all know about the discussions and speculations and rumours about President Biden's, shall we say, physical difficulties. Maybe he doesn't feel up to talking to Putin, and maybe he sent Burns to speak on his behalf to Putin in Moscow because he doesn't feel up to doing it himself, and he doesn't trust his foreign policy team to do it in his place. But it does seem to me that there is a much more likely and far more plausible explanation, and one which tells us some rather disturbing things about the state of the administration and the position of the president within it. The reason, I suspect, why Joe Biden didn't pick up the telephone call and talk directly to Putin is because when the President of the United States calls a foreign leader on the phone, there are all sorts of other people listening in. The entire foreign policy staff in the United States is there listening in to what the President of the United States is saying to the President of Russia. Indeed, as we saw in the case of the first impeachment of Donald Trump, some officials, in that particular case, Alexander Vindman, who was an official listening into the call from the National Security Council in the United States, some officials, if they don't like what the president says, are prepared to take action to undermine the president's position if they feel that the position of the president is straying from the official policy of what they like to call the interagency, whatever that is. So it seems to me that Biden is nervous about talking to Putin because he doesn't trust his foreign policy team. He doesn't trust the staff of the National Security Council. He is concerned about the interagency. He feels that he can't talk to Putin directly over the phone because he's worried that if he does, and if he makes and says things to Putin, which people within the US government might not approve of, then in that case, a political crisis will be stirred up in the United States, as happened repeatedly with Donald Trump, and he doesn't want to be put in that position. Biden doesn't want to be put in that position. So he sends instead the man he trusts, William Burns, the CIA director, to Moscow. And whilst in Moscow, the CIA director, even though he can't actually physically meet Putin, nonetheless is able to do something which the CIA director and the president isn't able apparently to do whilst in the United States, which is pick up the telephone and speak directly to the Russian leader without having the entire national security team, riddled as it is with neocons, listening in. One assumes that Burns spoke from a phone line, presumably in the US Embassy, but as we know, the US Embassy is not fully staffed, and one assumes that the US Embassy in Moscow is under tighter control than would be the case in the White House, making it easier for the CIA director to talk to the Russian president without having scores of people listening in and taking notes of everything that is said and preparing some sort of action in consequence. Of course, it might be even worse than that if the CIA director spoke to the Russian president using a Russian phone, a secure Russian phone, perhaps in the Kremlin, perhaps whilst he was visiting and meeting with Patrushev in the offices of the Security Council, the Russian Security Council, which is, I believe, located either in the Kremlin itself or in the building of the executive office in Staraya Ploshad, Old Square in Moscow. Well, that would make the telephone call even more secure from if the intention really was to cut out the rest of the foreign policy bureaucracy. Well, I have to say straight away, there's a great deal of speculation in all the things that I've just said, and I want to make it very clear that I'm sure that Burns and the president have provided an account of Burns' trip to Moscow, which has been circulated across the US foreign policy community. But of course, it's one thing for there to be a discussion and explanation of what happened over the course of a call, quite another thing for the foreign policy team to be themselves listening in and putting their own spin and interpretation of what is said. So it looks to me, and this is my own view, I accept that this is to some extent guesswork, that Burns did go to Moscow. He did have these meetings with Patrushev and Narishkin. He was sent there by Biden. Part of the purpose was for Burns to talk to Putin himself. Burns was able eventually to get through to Putin, though only over the phone, and part of the purpose of conducting this strange trip in that sort of way was to convey a message directly to the president of Russia, cutting out the entire foreign policy team that exists in the White House, the State Department, and the National Security Council, to do it in a secure way, which would not result in details of the telephone call, of the discussion being leaked to the entire US media, and without officials, neocon officials and people like that, in the US bureaucracy agitating to undermine what was said and what was done. Now, why would that happen? Well, it suggests to me that the President of the United States and some of his advisors are exceptionally concerned about the situation in relations with Russia. And in fact, there's good reasons for concern. Now, let's go back to that Russian account of what Putin and Burns said to each other. And the Russian account is that They discussed the diplomatic crisis, regional conflicts, and cyber security, as well as Russia-US relations. Now, note that it's the Russians who are providing this information. Again, I think the Russians leaked all the information about Burns's visit to Moscow. I think this visit was intended to be secret. The Russians have been dribbling out information about it, and they've now dribbled out this information about this discussion between Putin and Burns. I don't think it was ever intended that it would be published, or at least not intended by the United States, that it would be revealed and published in that sort of way. So what do we get, what sense do we get from this very brief, extremely uninformative in some ways, explanation of what they discussed? Well, Russia-US relations doesn't really mean a great deal. The diplomatic crisis clearly means the situation with the embassies and the consulates that the two countries have in each other's countries. We know that ever since 2008, there's been severe sanctions. 2016, there's been extreme restrictions placed by each country on the operation of the other's embassy, and that in the terms of the US embassy in Moscow, it is barely functioning at the moment, and the United States is desperate to try to get that situation reversed, but finds it extremely difficult to agree with the Russians a way forward which would allow diplomats from both countries to return to the other and to start working properly again. We know that this was a difficult topic of discussion between the Russians and Victoria Nuland when she visited Moscow. We know that the Russians found Nuland entirely unreceptive to all discussion on this issue, and that the neocons in the United States refused to accept that this is an act, this situation, this diplomatic crisis makes any attempt to try to improve relations between Russia and the United States. It makes it all but impossible. And then, of course, there's the reference to cyber security. Well, this is something that's been talked about. I'm sure there's been talk about Russian hacking and all that sort of thing. I doubt that there's been a huge amount of new ground broken on that topic. Regional conflicts is where the whole issue, I'm sure, comes down to. And regional conflicts in this context almost certainly is code for the situation in Ukraine. And as I discussed in my last program, we've had this strange article in CNN which basically says that Burns was sent to Moscow because Biden, the US government, are extremely worried that the situation is deteriorating in Ukraine. It's spiraling out of control there. There is a deepening energy crisis in Ukraine. Things are turning extremely bad there. There is a political crisis developing on top of that. There's been also signs of growing conflict on the ceasefire line between the Ukrainians and the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. There have been contradictory reports about whether or not a drone imported from Turkey and used by the Ukrainian armed forces, or not, as the case may be, was actually used. And there's been lots of talk, much discussion about this, and also concerns, denied even by the Ukrainians, about an alleged build-up of Russian forces on Ukraine's border. Well, there's been concerns about this, and we learned from that CNN article, that Burns went to Moscow in order to try to de-escalate and diffuse tensions with the Russians, and that he afterwards spoke to Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, also with the intention of seeking to de-escalate tensions. That's what the CNN article tells us. As I said, we have to take it with a giant pinch of salt, given the source, which, as I said, is CNN, but that's what it says. And regional conflicts, the reference to regional conflicts in the TASS article suggests that it was the situation in and around Ukraine that is the cause of concern. But it's important to say that at the same time as the situation in Ukraine politically and economically continues to deteriorate, there is also a steady escalation, not just of Russian moves, but of US military moves also. And here we need to discuss briefly the political situation. We've seen Yulia Tymoshenko, the perennial figure in Ukrainian politics. She's now coming out openly and saying that the Ukrainians should have done a deal with the Russians to buy natural gas from Russia directly back in summer. She's criticized the whole reverse flow mythology, this idea that Ukraine buys its natural gas from Europe and that it somehow goes up the pipeline coming up against the Russian gas which is flowing down the pipeline. Anyway, that, she says, is all utter nonsense. What's actually happening is that the Ukrainians have been siphoning off gas that's flowing to Europe and paying the Europeans for the privilege. Now, it seems that this is causing great problems, and of course, great problems, because of course European gas prices have exploded, causing an energy crisis in Ukraine this winter. But of course, there is a further concern, and it's a longer term concern about this, because the Russians have been signaling over the last few weeks that when Nord Stream 2 is completed and up and running, and there's growing numbers of German politicians who are saying that Nord Stream 2 needs to be switched on very soon in order to deal with the energy crisis in Germany. I'm going to discuss that in a separate video shortly. Once Nord Stream 2 is up and running, and once the present transit agreement with Ukraine expires in 2024, the Russians have been dropping heavy hints that after 2024, Ukraine will cease to be a transit country. In fact, Russian gas will cease to flow via Ukraine to Europe. Now, when that happens, obviously, this whole mythology of reverse flow will end, because there will be no Russian gas destined for Europe passing through those pipelines, which the Ukrainians can siphon off. The only way Ukraine can get gas at that point is by negotiating a direct gas deal with the Russians. And that, of course, is something which is proving politically extremely difficult. And that is, I think, the point that Tymoshenko is, in a coded way, trying to make. She's saying that the time has come for Ukraine to negotiate that direct gas deal with the Russians. Otherwise, after 2024, the lights across Ukraine will go out, and they might flicker and go out to a great extent in Ukraine this winter, because, to say it straightforwardly, the Ukraine can't afford to pay gas for its gas at European prices at the present time. So that's a gathering political crisis. Ukraine can't import coal from Russia. The Russians in October said that they would have to stop providing coal for Ukrainian power stations. The Ukrainians then refused to buy coal from the Russians at all, even though the Russians said that they would resume coal supplies after the 8th of November. Now the Ukrainians are saying that they won't buy any more coal. And now the Ukrainians are also grumbling that they can't get coal from Kazakhstan as well. And they're blaming the Russians for that. So their energy crisis is taking a further spiral downward. And as if this wasn't all bad enough, what you've been seeing, and I've discussed this in other programs, a reshuffle at the highest levels of the Ukrainian defense establishment. The defense minister has resigned. There have been all sorts of new people brought into the Ukrainian military leadership, including Dmitry Yarosh, an extreme ultra-right, ultra-nationalist hardliner, former head of right sector. He's been appointed to a special position within the defense ministry, advising the Ukrainian commander-in-chief. Though I would add, since he is not a military man, what kind of advice he's in a position to give to the commander-in-chief of Ukraine, I'm not really sure. It sounds to me that he's been appointed to this position in effect as some kind of political commissar in preparation for, well, who knows what precisely. And then there's all the accompanying American military moves. Now, I've not really talked about these at the moment, but at this particular juncture, there are 2 US warships in the Black Sea. One of those warships is an Arleigh Burke destroyer, but there are also other warships in the Black Sea, US warships as well. And we've got a discussion of all of this from the Russian newspaper Viedomosti. And this is what Viedomosti has to say about this topic. It's not Viedomosti, it's actually Izvestia. And Izvestia says the following. A few days ago, the US 6th Fleet's flagship, Mount Whitney, and destroyer Potter sailed across the Bosphorus into the Black Sea. Izvestia talked to experts about what this means for Russia and what the dangers might be. Mount Whitney's chief weapons are communications and coordination, rather than cannons, machine guns, or its helicopter. The ship consists of admirals' cabins, which makes it possible to gather on board Navy representatives from Ukraine, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Romania. This would result in the headquarters of an international coalition capable of tackling global challenges in the Black Sea. This, for example, happened in 2011 during NATO's intervention in Libya. The brains of the operation were located on board Mount Whitney. According to Alexei Leonkov, a military expert, the main task of the US 6th Fleet flagship, located in the Black Sea, is to provide information interaction between the forces of the 6th Fleet, located in the Mediterranean, and those countries with which the 6th Fleet is conducting joint exercises. Mount Whitney has a history of appearing near Russia during times of crisis. For instance, in 2008, during the conflict in Georgia, and during Ukraine's Maidan upheaval in 2014, and then the ship even entered Sevastopol. The ship docked in the military unit of the port of Sevastopol. However, due to local protests, the crew did not come ashore. Then the main task of the ship was to annoy Russia. And while the methods have changed, the goal, according to the General of the French Armed Forces, ex-head of the French military mission to the United Nations, Dominique Trincard, has not. So that's what Izvestia says is the purpose of sending Mount Whitney to the Black Sea. Note that it is accompanied by Potter, USS Potter, which is an Arleigh Burke destroyer. And we learn that the Russians have been conducting exercises of their own in response to the presence of these 2 powerful US warships in the Black Sea. We read, for example, from TASS, that the crew of the Black Sea Fleet's Admiral Essen, this is a powerful missile frigate operated within the Black Sea, the Russian Black Sea Fleet, that the crew of the Black Sea Fleet's frigate Admiral Essen held an exercise to shield a naval base from a notional enemy's missile strike. And the air defense team of the Black Sea Fleet's frigate Admiral Essen held drills to protect a naval base from a notional enemy missile strike, the fleet's press service reported on Sunday. Currently, 2 warships are operating in the Black Sea, the flagship command ship Mount Whitney and the guided missile destroyer USS Porter. The Russian Black Sea Fleet's forces and capabilities are keeping a close eye on the US warships in the Black Sea. The US Sixth Fleet earlier announced that the warships had deployed to the Black Sea for joint operations with NATO allies and partners in the region. And then we get the readout from the Black Sea Fleet's notification. The crew of the Black Sea Fleet's frigate Admiral Essen held an exercise to shield a naval base from a notional enemy missile strike. Under the scenario of the exercise, the Black Sea Fleet's Command and Control Center received data on the takeoff of a group of enemy planes towards the Crimean Peninsula. A signal about the approaching notional enemy air group was transmitted to all the fleet's naval task forces to effectively apportion the targets. The air defense capabilities aboard the frigate Admiral Essen were also put on high alert. In the course of the exercise, the fleet's air defense squad locked on and eliminated the mock enemy's aircraft by the surface-to-air missile systems designed to protect the ship from all air attack weapons. The targets were simulated electronically by the ship's armament control systems and notionally eliminated before the enemy aircraft made an approach for an attack. The frigate's crew also practiced measures from a shipborne Kharmov 27M anti-submarine warfare helicopter to take off from land and land on the deck whilst the ship was on the move. The exercise was held as part of the Black Sea Fleet's combat training plan. Now, it's not difficult to guess that the naval base that's been talked about in this readout is Sevastopol, and that Admiral Essen was carrying out a combat exercise rehearsing, in effect, the defense of Sevastopol in the event that US aircraft or warships were to try to attack it. I say US aircraft or warships, could be NATO warships, NATO aircraft and warships, could also be, of course, Ukrainian aircraft and warships. But note how TASS combines the reports of this exercise with information about the presence of these 2 US warships in the Black Sea, USS Mount Whitney and USS Porter. And along with all of that, we learn that the Caspian Sea flotilla, its airborne assault units, carried out an exercise to eliminate a landing operation, an attempted amphibious landing on the Russian coast. This comes directly from the Russian Defense Ministry's website. The servicemen of the airborne assault units of the Marine Corps of the Caspian Flotilla eliminated the illegal armed formation of a mock enemy on the seashore. The Marines, with the help of unmanned aerial vehicles, found the enemy's armed forces in remote areas of the seashore and promptly moved to the areas on upgraded armoured personnel carriers BTR-82A and armoured vehicles Tiger. The Marines carried out the demolition of the van equipment and the fire defeat of the mock enemy from all types of weapons. During the combat mission, the servicemen captured one of the members of the illegal armed formation and destroyed the main group of the enemy. To create a tactical background, simulation tools were needed, including smoke bombs and light noise simulation tools. More than 200 military personnel of the Marine Corps units took part in the exercise. About 20 units of military equipment were involved. Now that's in the Caspian Sea, but I would say that the Caspian Sea is connected to the Black Sea by various waterways, artificial waterways, which the Russians have constructed, and the Russians used the Caspian Sea as a kind of reserve area where they position warships and personnel in preparation for moving them as the need might arise to the Black Sea. Now, this exercise, which I've just discussed, about eliminating an amphibious unit, a unit which has landed on the Russian Sea, sounds like an anti-terrorism exercise, but it could also have been intended to prepare for a possible counter to the landing of sabotage units on the Russian coastline by Ukraine, or conceivably by the United States in the event of conflict. And note that USS Mount Whitney is an amphibious warship. It's tasked with landing Marines on the coastline of countries like, well, conceivably Russia in this case. And we also learn that the Russian defense minister himself has been making statements about the situation. He's been saying that the situation with foreign warships in the Black Sea is testing the strength of Russia's borders. And this is from TASS again. The US and NATO-guided missile ships that entered the Black Sea are attempting to test the strength of Russia's Black Sea coast and southern border protection, Russian Defense Minister Army General Sergei Shoigu said on Sunday. Well, you know what? When we see this, when a warship belonging to a non-regional power enters the Black Sea, and we understand that it carries long-range precision weapons, when we see that these weapons are boarded and it is not on a tourist tour, we naturally keep a close eye on it and track it, and we understand that any provocations are possible at any time, as was the case recently with a British destroyer, and of course we must prevent such things. Shoigu said in a live broadcast on the TV program Moscow, Kremlin, Putin, responding to questions from journalist Pavel Zarubin. To speak more exactly, this is of course almost a constant attempt to test us, to see how much we are prepared and how effectively we have built our system along the Black Sea coast and generally in the south of our country. As the Russian defense chief stressed, they are not alone in such tests of strength and approaches. As I understand it, they're subsequently planning drills with our neighbours, drills with the Georgian and Ukrainian navies, but we also hold drills and we will keep doing so. And then the TASS report of Shoigu's words goes on to say, currently 2 US warships are operating in the Black Sea, the flagship command ship Mount Whitney and the guided missile destroyer Porter. The Russian Black Sea Fleet's forces and capabilities are keeping a close eye on the US warships in the Black Sea. The US Sixth Fleet earlier announced that the warships had deployed to the Black Sea for joint operations with NATO allies and partners in the region. So we have a situation where the US and Russian navies are exercising against each other in the Black Sea, where the United States Navy is deploying very powerful warships in the Black Sea, where there's a general crisis in Ukraine, a crisis, an energy crisis, which is now feeding into a political crisis, and which crisis is likely to get worse as the prospect of Ukraine losing its position as a transit state looms. We see also the gathering of Russian troops at their rear bases located far away from the Ukrainian border, but places where they've been conducting exercises and where they might be preparing to strike. Well, it's perhaps not surprising that the President of the United States, who intervened to diffuse tensions way back in April, and who clearly doesn't want a war in Ukraine, which will disrupt his policies and create a crisis situation for him and for his administration, it's not surprising that the President of the United States is again extremely concerned about the situation and has again acted to try to de-escalate the situation. He can't this time call those warships back from the Black Sea because they're already there, but he can send the CIA director to Moscow, the only person in his administration whom he apparently fully trusts with a mission of this kind. He sends him to Moscow, just as he previously sent him on a top-secret mission to Kabul, to Afghanistan, during the US withdrawal from there. He sent him to Moscow in order, I suspect, to reassure the Russians that the US president, does not want a war in Ukraine, and to try to bring the situation under some kind of control. And going back to that CNN report, we see how Burns then telephones Zelensky, tells Zelensky, or so it seems to me, to back off. And this time, and completely unsurprisingly and very weirdly, we see the Ukrainians apparently responding to the pressure that they've come under from the US, from the CIA director, coming out and contradicting the US media about Russian troop deployments on their borders. They've been told this time that the game of talking up tension with Russia is not looked on with favor in the White House, and if they want to work constructively with the United States, they must temper their rhetoric, and on this occasion, they appear to be doing so. And I suspect that's the reason why the Ukrainians, who never hesitate to talk up a potential threat from Russia, on this occasion seem to be trying to talk it down. They've been told to do so by the director of the CIA, by William Burns, on instructions from the United States president. Well, it's all in total an incredibly untidy situation. We see the president doesn't trust his own foreign policy team to try to avoid a war in Ukraine, that he's alarmed by developments on the ground, including developments presumably involving his own warships. He apparently doesn't trust his officials to carry out diplomacy for him, either with respect to the Russians or with respect to the Chinese, but specifically with respect to the Russians. In this case, he has to go round, find ways round his foreign policy team. He doesn't dare, apparently, to pick up the telephone and speak to the Russian president himself. He has to send instead the director of the CIA to Moscow and get the director of the CIA to put pressure on his behalf with the Ukrainians. Or at least that's how it looks to me. And we see that the Russians, for their part, are utterly exasperated and annoyed about the whole affair. They're far from happy about this whole situation. They don't see why they should play along. So they've leaked to the world the fact that Burns was indeed on this mission to Moscow. They've published incredibly brief readouts. They refused to have their president meet with Burns in Moscow in the way that Burns presumably wanted. They've obliged Burns to speak to Putin on the phone, and they're dribbling out information about this trip by Burns to Moscow in a way that clearly the US hadn't expected and doesn't entirely like. Well, when a situation is as untidy and as unstable as this, when the president is clearly finding it difficult to keep control of his own administration, where he's worried about neocon advisors and neocon officials, but doesn't have apparently the political strength to sack these people and replace them with people that he trusts and who are loyal to himself, when he has to engage in this kind of secret diplomacy, well, this is all a very bad situation indeed. And I do wonder how long this whole thing can continue for. We see that someone in the administration is keen on some sort of confrontation with Russia in the Black Sea. That, by the way, is consistent with that latest NATO program, which envisages some sort of showdown with Russia all the way from the Black Sea to the Baltic and beyond. And it looks as if this is partly what all these maneuvers and movements are all about. The reality, as wiser heads in Washington, Burns, for example, and Biden also presumably, must be aware of, is that if there was a war in Ukraine, if there was a fight in the Black Sea, if the United States were to be dragged in this part of the world, the Russians have an overwhelming advantage. That's what Shoigu essentially was telling us. But it seems that some people in the United States find that impossible to accept, that they're in denial about it. And in the meantime, with the clock ticking on Ukraine, with Nord Stream 2 almost ready to go into operation, with serious doubts about the continued flow of gas via the pipelines from Russia across Ukraine, which Ukraine needs to siphon off gas to keep its economy going, with demands from people like Tymoshenko that Ukraine starts negotiations with Russia, something which, as I said, the hardliners there find unacceptable. The situation is becoming extremely volatile. The head of Naftogaz, Ukraine's national gas company, has even said recently that completion of Nord Stream 2 increases the prospect of war between Ukraine and Russia. An extraordinary statement, but one which makes a kind of sense when you start unpicking all the various pieces. So here we are, an unstable situation, a president who is hardly in control of his administration. I have to say, this is a very worrying state of affairs. Indeed, I don't think the Russians are impressed. I certainly don't think they're happy. I do wonder where all this is going to go. But this is how I reconstruct the situation at the moment. I suspect we are in for some very rocky weeks and months ahead in Ukraine. Thank you for joining me for this program today. I look forward to you joining me in future programs, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. You can also check us out on our other platforms, especially Locals, where we have a thriving community, where we're increasingly publishing exclusive content, and where you will find our community also busy providing information, doing various things themselves, publishing their own content. If you want to come to Locals, you can join us there. And by the way, I'm increasingly doing live streams on Locals also. And we're starting to do collaborative live streams also. And you can join us also on other platforms, BitChute, Library, Rumble, Odyssey, and the rest. and you can support us via Patreon and Subscribe Star. And you can also support us by going to our shop and buying the great things you will find there. Our Duran hats, our magic mugs, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all the rest. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a wonderful day until then.